from Abuja.
Hello, thank you for being a part of our show. We appreciate you. I'm Magnus kpakol, and this is Magnus kpakol GVA, Global Views Africa. As you know, it's all about how we can raise the level of living. That's what it's all about. In view today, a continuation of our discussion with Ambassador Tom Amolo on conflict, violence, and development in Africa. But before that, in our hidden economics, the economics of unintended consequences, lower fuel prices, fighting corruption, and poverty reduction. These could all be promoted, but be careful to use the right strategies to avoid negative unintended consequences. Now up next, we bring you a public trust evaluation in our quick view. That's coming right up. For democracy to succeed in Africa, there must be a change in the culture to one that accepts and gives primacy to the public trust principle. It has to be the primary issue at stake when electing people to political office and in general when evaluating the performance of politicians. Perhaps this is reflected in the election results when Nigerians said they had voted for change by throwing out the People's Democratic Party, PDP, in favor of the All Progressives Congress in the recent federal electoral polls. It is clear across the world that there is a significant correlation between the social well-being of the people and public trust. In this connection, which of the following African countries ranks in the top 10 in the world in public trust? Ghana, Botswana, Mauritius, and Rwanda. Which of the following countries ranks the highest in public trust in Europe? Norway, Germany, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Stay with us for our answers coming up shortly. Still in view, Ambassador Tom Amolo, High Commissioner of Kenya to Nigeria, as we continue our discussion with him on conflict, violence, and economic development in Africa. But up next in our hidden economics, the economics of unintended consequences. Ever heard of the Cobra effect? The term originates from an anecdote from the time of British colonial rule in India. At the time, the British government was concerned about the number of venomous cobra snakes in Delhi. The government therefore offered a reward for every dead cobra. Initially, this was a successful strategy as large numbers of snakes were killed for the reward. However, it turned out that eventually enterprising persons began to breed cobras for their income. When the government became aware of this, the reward program was scrapped. The consequence was that all of the cobras that had been bred had to be set free because they were now worthless, a situation that increased the cobra population in the wild. The apparent solution for the problem made the situation worse. In another example of unintended consequences, the Nigerian government was forced to maintain a very expensive fuel subsidy program in order to reduce the price of fuel for the masses. It wasn't long before the program, riddled with fraud, became too expensive to implement. To make matters worse, crude oil prices dropped significantly, reducing Nigeria's ability to pay for the subsidy, as it imports much of its refined petroleum products, in spite of the fact that the country is the 12th largest producer of crude oil in the world. Eventually, matters came to a head as disagreement between the government and the contracted fuel importers caused the price of fuel to more than double from the subsidized price, a clear unintended consequence of the subsidy program. Bottom line, it is not that the intentions to overcome the problems are bad. it is that the solutions are usually not well thought through. Our hidden economics for you. Before we start our discussion in view, here are our quick view answers. Rwanda is the African country that, according to the World Economic Forum's World Competitiveness Report of 2015, ranked number 10 in the world in the trust that the people have in the ethical standards of its politicians. Norway is the European country with the highest level of public trust. For more information on our show, see our contacts displayed on the screen. As we concluded last time, many of the ongoing conflicts and related violence in Africa are subnational and to a reasonable extent declining in intensity as improved leadership is causing economic development on the continent to gain speed. Today we pick up on our discussion with Ambassador Tom Amalo, High Commissioner of Kenya to Nigeria. Mr. Amalo served as High Commissioner of Kenya to South Africa before being posted to Nigeria. He has an extensive background in diplomacy and international relations, with previous assignments at the Kenya Mission at the United Nations in New York and the Embassy of the Republic of Kenya in Washington, D.C., among other places. Please join me in my discussion with Ambassador Tom Amalo. So I think that you said it right even at the beginning. You know, we say Africa is rising. And I was happy when you said that, you know, we've seen a sharp decline in the level of conflict and violence in Africa from the 80s to today, which is true. And then that's also coincided with the period when Africa is said to be rising. Even, I mean, having come out of the so-called 2 lost decades of the 80s and 90s. The Africa rising, which to me means stronger economic growth, is that coincident or is it as a result of decline in violence, in conflict? Or it is originating from some other causes?
It's a very well thought out presentation, thought you put there, because where's the chicken, where's the egg? I think that over the 50 plus years we've been independent, we've experimented, and a lot of these experiments have failed. And the leadership we had, first of all, the leadership that gave us independence, that leadership came on a nationalistic platform, which after a period of time, 10, 20 years, was not enough to sustain the expectations of the people. So it had to dissipate. Then we came upon a period of dictatorship, where those who took over wanted to self-aggrandize, to have put money in their pockets, basically. And the people said no. So we had a third level now of democracy, people, real leaders saying, okay, let's change the narrative. And that narrative now has changed, finally. So you find that putting together all the instruments of governance, of economy, diminishing corruption, and so on, has become what most governments in Africa are looking for. So you find the boats are being lifted, okay? The water is rising, the boats are lifted. And you know, a rising tide lifts boats and everybody else. So Africa is rising because of first of all, because of the challenges we had. We don't want to go back there. And secondly, because of good policies put forward by government that begins to say, we cannot have business as usual. No more subsidies, no more corruption, no more what. And people are saying, okay, we'll suffer a bit, but the trend line is positive. Let's go for it. And I can tell you, if you look across the continent of Africa, when you say Africa is rising, across the board, That is the narrative. And I think we need to add another element to this positive economic nationalistic narrative, and that is we need as Africans to have what some people call an affirmative narrative, a narrative that affirms an African as somebody who can accomplish on his own, that does not require the support or requires only assistance in terms of an environment, a level playing field, to be able to attain certain goals for her people. And we're getting there. If you look at how in Kenya, for example, in the 80s, 60, 70, 50, no more, sorry, 80% of our budget was external, World Bank and so on. Now, 90% of our budget is local. We get all the money locally. We don't have oil to date. We're still looking for it. And if you look across the countries, if you look at Uganda, Tanzania, and so on, that has completely changed. Before we'd go cup in hand to Europe, Americas, begging, literally. That has changed completely. You find, in fact, traffic into Africa to look at our resources and to see where there are opportunities to maximize capital on their behalf. So Africa is right.
I think that you said it right even at the beginning. But there's another kind of violence and conflict that I wanted to kind of segue to, and what I often call structural violence, where there's violence because we did not provide good roads.
Yes.
And so there are accidents, people get killed. There's violence because due to corruption or whatever, we did not provide good hospitals, basic medical facilities. And as a result, our kids die, from diseases that should never kill people anywhere in the advanced economies. So where is the resource base growing at just 5%, even though we say Africa is rising, but growing at just about 5%? Is that strong enough to be competitive, to be able to bring the technology, the kinds of medical facilities, the infrastructure that would be needed to cause us to keep on rising when the population is growing?
The simple answer is no, and I'll tell you why. But it doesn't mean the no means we cannot be creative about obtaining solutions. The reason why these challenges exist and these structural violence occurs is because we haven't thought through how to enable us to put the infrastructure in place. And now we have various weapons, so to speak, private-public partnerships. We have external investment. And external investment now has a new face, and the new face is African. We have Africans investing in Africa. Heretofore, all the investment we begged for came from the UK, from the Europe, and from Americas and Asia. And the new face of investment in Africa is African. Secondly, it's a truism that it's only when you trade among yourself intensively in a sub-region that you grow.
Are we doing that?
No, and I think that is the biggest challenge. If you look at the Asian countries, over 60% of the trade that enables them to be who they are is among themselves. So it is with the European Union. So it is with the Americas. So we in Africa have to go in that direction. Now, the only way we can do that is if we have good infrastructure. There is no road that takes me from Nairobi to Lagos. Before Kenya Airways and Ethiopian Airways and Rwanda Airways, to come to Togo, I'd have to catch a flight to Paris, wait 2 days and come to Togo. To come to Liberia, I'd have to go through London, wait 2 days and come to, or a day and come into Liberia. So now, we've broken that. The infrastructure we're creating through air has to now be replicated on the ground. Better road structures, Cape Town to Cairo roads, the Northern Corridor. These things are happening. They're not happening as quickly as we should.
Because
President Uhuru Kenyatta.
Failure?
Because the thinking is now just beginning to seep in. In the AU now, there is a package called 2063, where they're looking at how the roads, the infrastructure, shipping, roads, railways, can create an environment where Africans can trade among themselves. In addition to that, the most difficult thing for an African today is traveling to another African country, because there's an animal called a visa. And these visa regimes that we've created to stop ourselves from moving into each other's country is hampering trade. So Rwanda is changing that. We in Kenya are moving towards that. Now a Nigerian can walk into Kenya at the airport and get a visa. A Kenyan can walk into Lagos or Abuja and get a visa upon arrival. Now if we have that, have good infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't just mean road, railways, and it means the challenges that come with, say, clearing goods, the customs regimes, the immigration regimes. So there's a play now. What is happening now is we're beginning to address that. Because we just started easily, what, 5, 6 years ago, and the most 10 years ago, we're looking at easily another 5 more years for it to begin having a beneficial effect. In Southern Africa, because of many reasons, you found that SADC has got a better infrastructure among itself. In Eastern Africa, it is easier to go to Uganda and Tanzania, but it's not very easy to go to Ethiopia, Sudan, and so on. It's not easy at all to go from East Africa to West Africa.
As we close in just a few seconds, can you give your final thoughts on this issue of conflict, violence, and development? So looking at Africa down the road, what do you see as the future of Africa? Is that a place where it's completely free of conflicts, at least the ones that lead to violence, and you have an Africa that is developing at pace with the East Asian countries?
The answer is yes. The answer is yes. And I believe now the leadership that we have, not only in our continental body, the African Union, the leadership is solid, is visionary, is driven, it has a clear strategy. Secondly, within the context of the African economic communities put forward in the Lagos Plan of Action, that the sub-regions are putting together mechanisms, infrastructures that will enable their sub-regions to flourish with good leadership, an infrastructure that enables them to flourish. Thirdly, I think if you look at the leadership that we have now, from President Uhuru Kenyatta, President Buhari, look at what's happening across the continent, President Kagame, and so on and so forth. You look across the continent, you have leaders who are not there because they want to put money in their pocket. They want to go there and change their societies. So this confluence of goodness is going to enable us to move forward. And I believe also that on the economic front, once we get the structures of governing our mineral, our economic wealth, the wealth of our nation, once we get that right, once our people realize that this wealth benefits all of us equally, and that it is my responsibility as a Kenyan, as a Nigerian, to protect the wealth of my country, God-given, and that this wealth, by the way, will get finished. If we don't have that, we're in serious problems. We have to take this opportunity to commend the people of Nigeria for a wonderful election that is replicable, that the structures you put in place and the way Nigerians conduct themselves is something that ought to be emulated across the continent. And in fact, if anything, if African leaders were to say anything, is that the way Nigeria acted should be able to get a Nobel Peace Prize, if not President Jonathan with the Nobel Peace Prize, that the Nigerian people should get the Nobel Peace Prize. Because if a Nigeria is in violence, attacking itself, it will spill over and bring the whole continent down. So again, kudos to Nigeria, and on behalf of the Kenyans who are watching, we want to give you the opportunity to please come to Nigeria, visit. They have good people like Magnus here, and opportunities to make money, and to make a business. And for Nigerians, please come and visit. Do not spend your hard-earned dollars in Europe. Come and visit Kenya. We have the best flora and fauna. The migration is on now, and we're going to have the Dreamliner taking Nigerians to Kenya to enjoy themselves. So welcome to Kenya to the Nigerians, and welcome to Nigeria to the Kenyans. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you, Magnus.
Great job. Great job. A good question is whether Africa's rising economic prosperity is sustainable. Certainly, it should be if conflict is minimized and policies optimized for present and coming challenges. Some commentators have tried to suggest that Africa has to avoid not only a poverty trap, but also a violence trap. I think in many cases, these commentators are surprisingly stuck in their view of Africa from the lost decades of the 1980s and 1990s. Africa is clearly changing, and the future looks brighter from a 2015 vantage point than from a 1995 position. 20 years of progress in many areas have helped. 1. The African Union, formerly Organization of African Unity, has taken a stronger leadership role in handling African problems previously turned over to the United Nations. Second, African leaders have emerged with the gravitas to command respect and attention across Africa. Third, macroeconomic policy making has improved significantly across Africa as democracy has taken root and now going through maturation, as recently confirmed in Nigeria, where President Jonathan was historically prompt in conceding defeat and congratulating Muhammadu Buhari, who had won the election. Fourth, African entrepreneurs and businesses are becoming more competitive across Africa and the world. And of course, to catalyze and facilitate all of this, favorable commodity prices as a whole has been a key driver of growth, benefiting traditional oil exporters such as Nigeria, Gabon, and Angola, and new ones like Ghana. In addition, demand for natural resources from emerging markets, especially China, has increased in the last decade and remains important as China continues to be economically and politically engaging in Africa. Over 2,000 Chinese enterprises are investing and developing in more than 50 African countries. Indeed, many estimates now suggest that about half of the world's future population growth will be driven by Africa. Not because of higher fertility, which is declining, but because of longer life expectancy. This trend, with conflicts and violence and deaths declining, could lead to a demographic dividend of an adult population of 800 million by 2030, compared to 460 million in 2010. Because of this, and with appropriate policies and technologies, Africa's resultant burgeoning middle class could generate hundreds of millions of consumers with a much increased purchasing power. I'm Magnus, and that's my view.